Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about a choice. Unlike most budget discussions we have on this floor, it's not a choice about spending priorities. This amendment would leave intact every single funding decision that's been made in the underlying budget bill. Every agency, program, service, contract, local government partner that's funded by this budget would still be funded even if this amendment were adopted. Instead, Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about a choice regarding how we pay for those things. It's about a choice to fund the budget with revenue that we're entitled to assume by statute or a tax increase that we don't need. Since the four-year balanced budget outlook was enacted, Mr. Speaker, every single biennial budget that we've adopted has far underestimated the outlook period revenue that's been assumed. Yes, we want to be cautious, but the 4.5% growth assumption that's in statute already is cautious. Assuming this revenue isn't a gimmick. It's simply following the law and following the process that we've had, that we followed for every single budget for the past decade. Mr. Speaker, I went back this morning and looked at how we have assumed this outlook period revenue since the four-year balanced budget outlook was enacted, and what revenue we ended up collecting. In 2013, the first year in which the four-year balanced budget was in effect, even with this extra 4.5% revenue assumption, we still underestimated revenue by $3 billion. In 2015, we underestimated it by $5 billion. In 2017, we underestimated it by $7 billion. And in 2019, it's hard to know exactly how it's going to shake out. That's part of what this amendment is about. But so far, even after all of the economic slowdown that happened over the last year related to coronavirus, we are still $1.4 billion higher in anticipated revenue than we originally assumed back in 2019. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about a choice to fund the budget in the same manner we've always funded it, or to assume a volatile and unpredictable revenue source that will jeopardize funding for items in the underlying budget, like the Working Families Tax Credit. Mr. Speaker, it's been pointed out that the revenue that we do rely on in past budgets and a portion of this budget is cyclical, that our consumption-based taxes will decrease during economic downturns, which is exactly when we need to ensure funding for critical services that people will depend on, because that demand for those demands increase. The capital gains tax that is assumed by the underlying budget, the tax that the assumption of which this amendment would undo, would not solve that problem. It would make it worse. In California and Oregon, two states that are very similar to ours and which do rely on a capital gains tax, in fact, they have the highest and fourth highest capital gains tax rates of any state in the country, respectively. Their budgets have fallen more than almost any other state. Mr. Speaker, luckily, our budget situation has not fallen. We actually have more revenue than we did at this period a year ago. And this question of volatility that would be assumed or that would be implicit in the underlying budget based on the revenue assumptions it currently makes. It's not an academic exercise. This budget, thankfully, funds the Working Families Tax Credit for the first time in that program's history. But in the underlying budget bill, it's assumed it's funded by an account that receives revenue from an assumed capital gains tax bill. And if another economic downturn hits and capital gains tax revenue decreases, revenue to that account will be the first to go away, which means that Working Families Tax Credit will be the program that is first on the chopping block. I realize that this Working Families Tax Credit will be funded, hopefully, for the first time in its history, but I don't think that means that it ought to be the first thing to go in an economic downturn. I think that that's critically important. The other things that would be funded by the capital gains tax that's assumed in this budget are childcare and higher ed funding. Mr. Speaker, I think that those things ought to be among the last things we consider unfunding, but by relying on and incorporating a capital gains tax, we risk those things because the capital gains tax itself is so inherently volatile and unpredictable. And this amendment would make sure that we do not have to deal with that volatility and that unpredictability. The amendment also involves a choice to fund this budget with existing revenue or rely on a new revenue stream that is potentially unconstitutional and potentially unpopular. Obviously, there are a lot of questions involving both of those things. There's been a lot of debate paid to that. And if the bill that's referenced by this amendment would come to the floor, we'll have ample opportunity to debate those questions at length. But I do think there is at least some risk involved. For example, the bill referenced by this amendment goes to great lengths to call itself an excise tax rather than income tax. I think there is incredible risk the court would agree. And even if the Supreme Court reverses its prior holdings and upholds the tax that's assumed by the budget, I believe strongly that superior courts and trial courts, if you will be required to enjoin the tax, enjoin collection of the tax until the Supreme Court overturns its prior precedent, which means that for the years in which the tax referenced by this amendment goes through the court system, the items funded by it will be at risk. Working families tax credit and child care will be at risk if this amendment is not adopted, because for several years, tax collections will almost certainly be enjoined. And even if courts agree that a capital gains tax is constitutional, I believe that voters will have deep antipathy towards it. And I believe that a capital gains tax is also at risk of being overturned by voters via a referendum or initiative. And if we do not adopt this amendment, that would then put at risk some of the funding that is provided through a capital gains tax. But instead, by adopting this amendment, we can ensure that we avoid those dangerous risks and fund those important programs out of our existing revenue. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is also about a choice to fund a budget that will help promote and accelerate a recovery, or pass a budget that relies on a tax that will hamper our recovery by disincentivizing entrepreneurs and innovators from betting on Washington. Mr. Speaker, we need to make this recovery happen as quickly as possible. And there are many items contained in the underlying bill that I think will help do that. But by relying on a tax that punishes investment, that makes it more expensive and reduces the anticipated return, I'm concerned that our recovery will take much longer, and we will have much other things we need to fund in the budget in future years to address that recovery. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about a choice between solving the flaws in our tax code by helping those who are taxed too much, or by punishing those who have experienced success. Again, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned before, the underlying budget funds the Working Families Tax Credit. I think that is a great tool to help reduce the tax burden on our fellow Washingtonians who pay too much. I believe that this underlying budget ought to address other ways to solve inequities in our tax code, rather than relying and address those inequities by helping the people who need the help. Instead, the budget as it exists today would rely on revenue that comes from taxing and punishing those who've experienced success. I think that's unnecessary, and this amendment is about a choice as to how we're going to solve those underlying tax issues. Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about a choice to pass a budget that could be broadly bipartisan, or one that I'm afraid will ultimately become too partisan. Mr. Speaker, as we'll address in final passage, this budget funds a lot of things that I think reflect our shared priorities. But I and a number of my colleagues on my side of the aisle have deep reservations about passing a tax that has all of these flaws, that punishes the people who are successful rather than helps those who need help, that disincentivize investment and entrepreneurship in Washington at a time when we need that more than ever. That creates substantial risk that the tax gets thrown out by courts who find it unconstitutional, or by voters who find it unpalatable, or that is sufficiently volatile, or so volatile that it causes us to be unable to fund other priorities that are otherwise funded in the budget.
The member has 30 seconds remaining. Please conclude.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, this amendment is about a choice. And I believe that if this amendment is adopted, the underlying bill will become that much better and probably enjoy my support and the support of many of my colleagues. We do not need to rely on new taxes to fund this budget. We can fund the budget with existing revenue, making the same assumptions we have always made every budget for the last 10 years.